Homelessness is the condition of people without a permanent dwelling, such as a house or apartment. People who are homeless are most often unable to acquire and maintain regular, safe, secure and adequate housing. The legal definition of homeless varies from country to country, or among different jurisdictions in the same country or region. The term homeless may also include people whose primary nighttime residence is in a homeless shelter, a warming center, a domestic violence shelter, long-term residence in a motel, a vehicle, squatting, cardboard boxes, a tent city, tarpaulins, shanty town structures made of discarded building materials or other ad hoc housing situations. According to the UK homelessness charity Crisis, a home is not just a physical space, it also provides roots, identity, security, a sense of belonging and a place of emotional well-being. American government homeless enumeration studies also include people who sleep in a public or private place not designed for use as a regular, sleeping accommodation for human beings. There are a number of organizations who provide help for the homeless. In 2005, an estimated 100 million people worldwide were homeless, and as many as 1 billion people live as squatters, refugees or in temporary shelter, all lacking adequate housing. In Western countries, the large majority of homeless are men, with single males particularly overrepresented. Most countries provide a variety of services to assist homeless people. These services often provide food, shelter and clothing and may be organized and run by community organizations or by government departments or agencies. These programs may be supported by the government, charities, churches and individual donors. Many cities also have street newspapers, which are publications designed to provide employment opportunity to homeless people. While some homeless have jobs, some must seek other methods to make a living. Begging or panhandling is one option, but is becoming increasingly illegal in many cities. People who are homeless may have additional conditions, such as physical or mental health issues or substance addiction. These issues make resolving homelessness a challenging policy issue. Definition and classification. The term unsheltered refers to that segment of a homeless community who do not have ordinary lawful access to buildings in which to sleep. Such persons frequently prefer the term houseless to the term homeless. Others may use the term street people, which does not fully encompass all unsheltered people, in that many such persons do not spend their time on urban street environments. Many shun such locales, because homeless people in urban environments may face the risk of being robbed or beaten up. Some people convert unoccupied or abandoned buildings, or inhabit mountainous areas or, more often, lowland meadows, creek banks and beaches. Many jurisdictions have developed programs to provide short-term emergency shelter. These are referred to as warming centers, and accredited by their advocates as life-saving. A portion of the homeless population are generally in transit, but there is no generally accepted terminology to describe them. Some nomenclature is frequently associated with derogatory connotations, and thus the professional and vernacular lingo to describe these persons is both evolving and not lacking in controversy. Much of the concern stems from the European situation, where homeless persons of Roma, Sinti and other ethnic descent have rejected the term gypsy. Other terms which some use regarding in-transit persons are transient, vagabond, tramp or drifter. Occasionally, these terms are interchanged with terms not necessarily implying that the person is a traveler, i.e. hobo. The term bum is used for persons lacking a work ethic. The term transient is frequently used in police reports, without any precise definitions across jurisdictions. It is complex and difficult to define homelessness. Many different definitions have been made and changes to the concept are constantly being brought to attention. The United States Congress has developed a definition that has gone through multiple changes. First applied in 1987, this general definition was provided and is now called the McKinney-Vento Act. As time went on and homelessness was still apparent in the USA, Congress added a definition for the homeless children and youths that will be using the educational programs. This change accrued in 2002. Congress, later, in 2009, enacted the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition Housing Act, also known as the HARTH Act. This broadened the general definition of homelessness and gave more consideration to help given to those who are considered homeless. Once again, in 2011, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development issued a final rule to implement changes to the definition of homeless in the HARTH Act. The implemented rule expands who is eligible for HUD-funded homeless assistance programs. United Nations definition. The United Nations, either via one of its agencies or via a vote in the General Assembly, has agreed upon various minimum conditions for a person to be countable as homeless. It is understood that these legal definitions for homelessness may date back to the beginnings of the UN in the late 1940s. The definition of a person being a refugee is at least partly linked to the definition of homelessness, as many refugees may have been or are homeless. In 2004, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs defined a homeless household as those households without a shelter that would fall within the scope of living quarters. They carried a few possessions with them, sleeping in the streets, in doorways or on piers, or in another space on a more or less random basis. In 2009, at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe Conference of European Statisticians, held in Geneva, Canton of Geneva, Switzerland, the group of experts on population and housing censuses defined homelessness as, in its recommendations for the censuses of population and housing, the SE identifies homeless people under two broad groups. Primary homelessness. This category includes persons living in the streets without a shelter that would fall within the scope of living quarters. Secondary homelessness. This category may include persons with no place of usual residence who move frequently between various types of accommodations. This category includes persons living in private dwellings but reporting no usual address on the census form. The SE acknowledges that the above approach does not provide a full definition of the homeless. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted the 10th of December 1948 by the UN General Assembly, contains this text regarding housing and quality of living. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. European typology of homelessness and housing exclusion. Homelessness is perceived and addressed differently according to country. The European typology of homelessness and housing exclusion was developed as a means of improving understanding and measurement of homelessness in Europe, and to provide a common language for transnational exchanges on homelessness. The ethos approach confirms that homelessness is a process that it affects many vulnerable households at different points in their lives. The typology was launched in 2005 and is used for different purposes: as a framework for debate, for data collection purposes, for policy purposes, monitoring purposes, and in the media. This typology is an open exercise which makes abstraction of existing legal definitions in the EU member states. It exists in 25 language versions, the translations being provided mainly by volunteer translators. Unsheltered or unhoused people. The word unhoused refers to that segment of a homeless community who do not have ordinary lawful access to buildings in which to sleep, as referred to in the HUD definition as persons occupying place not designed for sleeping accommodation for human beings. Such persons frequently prefer the term houseless to the term homeless. Recent homeless enumeration survey documentation utilizes the term unsheltered homeless. HUD requires jurisdictions which participate in continuum of care grant programs to count the homeless every 2 years. These counts have led to a variety of creative measures to avoid undercounting. Thus, teams of counters are often numbering in the hundreds in logistically complex volunteer efforts. Seek out the unsheltered in various nooks and crannies. There has been a significant number of unsheltered persons dying of hypothermia, adding impetus to the trend of establishing warming centers as well as extending the enumeration surveys with vulnerability indexes. History. Early history through the 1800s. Following the Peasants' Revolt, English constables were authorized under 1383 English Poor Laws statute to collar vagabonds and force them to show support. If they could not, the penalty was jail. Vagabonds could be sentenced to the stocks for 3 days and nights. In 1530, whipping was added. The presumption was that vagabonds were unlicensed beggars. In 1547, a bill was passed that subjected vagrants to some of the more extreme provisions of the criminal law, namely 2 years servitude and branding with AV as the penalty for the first offense and death for the second. Large numbers of vagabonds were among the convicts transported to the American colonies in the 18th century. During the 16th century in England, the state first tried to give housing to vagrants instead of punishing them, by introducing bridewells to take vagrants and train them for a profession. In the 17th and 18th centuries, these were replaced by workhouses, but these were intended to discourage too much reliance on state help. The growing movement towards social concern sparked the development of rescue missions, such as America's first rescue mission, the New York City Rescue Mission, founded in 1872 by Jerry and Maria McCauley. In smaller towns, there were hobos, who temporarily lived near train tracks and hopped onto trains to various destinations. Especially following the American Civil War, a large number of homeless men formed part of a counterculture known as hobohemia all over America. This phenomenon resurged in the 1930s during and after the Great Depression. In the modern world, home construction became increasingly specialized when electric wiring and plumbing was added to the cost of homes. Today, few people are capable of building their own homes. Specialization increases demand and price, which raises the cost of living. Building laws, codes, ordinances, and zoning limits may make home ownership even more expensive. In many places, houses without electricity and plumbing, or without foundations, that would once have been legal are now banned as substandard. The Industrial Revolution caused a great migration from the rural areas to urban areas, as people tried to seek factory jobs. Urban areas often have more complex building codes to handle the denser populations in modern cities. City ordinances coupled with higher land prices may make housing even more expensive in such urban areas. How the Other Half Lives later inspired Jack London's The People of the Abyss. This raised public awareness, causing some changes in building codes and some social conditions. These were later replaced by dormitory housing provided by local boroughs, and these were researched by the writer George Orwell. By the 1930s in England, there were 30,000 people living in these facilities. In 1933, George Orwell wrote about poverty in London and Paris in his book Down and Out in Paris and London. In general, in most countries, many towns and cities had an area which contained the poor, transients, and afflicted, such as at Skid Row. In New York City, for example, there was an area known as Bowery, traditionally, where alcoholics were to be found sleeping on the streets, bottle in hand. The Great Depression of the 1930s caused a devastating epidemic of poverty, hunger, and homelessness. There were 2 million homeless people migrating across the United States. Many lived in shanty towns they called Hoovervilles. In the 1960s, the nature and growing problem of homelessness changed in England as public concern grew. The number of people living rough in the streets had increased dramatically. However, beginning with the Conservative administration's Rough Sleeper initiative, the number of people sleeping rough in London fell dramatically. This initiative was supported further by the incoming Labour administration from 2009 onwards, with the publication of the Coming In from the Cold strategy published by the Rough Sleepers Unit, which proposed and delivered a massive increase in the number of hostel bed spaces in the capital and an increase in funding for street outreach teams, who work with rough sleepers to enable them to access services. Modern homelessness started as a result of economic stresses in society and reductions in the availability of affordable housing such as single-room occupancies for poorer people. In the United States, in the 1970s, the deinstitutionalization of patients from state psychiatric hospitals was a precipitating factor that seeded the homeless population, especially in large cities like New York City. Others feel that Ronald Reagan's signing of the Landsman-Petrus Short Act greatly exacerbated homelessness among the mentally ill. This law lowered the standards for involuntary commitment in civil courtrooms and was followed by significant funding of 1,700 hospitals caring for mental patients. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 was a predisposing factor in setting the stage for homelessness in the United States. Long-term psychiatric patients were released from state hospitals into SROs and supposed to be sent to community mental health centers for treatment and follow-up. It never quite worked out properly. The community mental health centers mostly did not materialize, and this population largely was found living in the streets soon thereafter with no sustainable support system. Also, as real estate prices and neighborhood pressure increased to move these people out of their areas, the SROs diminished in number, putting most of the residents in the streets. Other populations were mixed in later, such as people losing their homes for economic reasons, and those with addictions, the elderly, and others. Trends in homelessness are closely tied to neighborhood conditions, according to a report by the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation in 1990. Churches, public libraries, and atriums began restricting access as the homeless population grew larger. Park benches started to be designed so that no one could lie down on them. Some churches restricted access when mass services were not being held. Libraries began enforcing no eyes shut and sometimes dress codes. Some public places hired private security guards to carry out these policies, creating social tension. Many public toilets have been closed. This banished the homeless population to sidewalks, parks, under bridges, and the like. They also lived in New York City subway tunnels. They tried to be socially invisible to avoid enforcement of new anti-vagrancy penalties. In 2002, research showed that children and families were the largest growing segment of the homeless population in the United States, and this has presented new challenges, especially in services to agencies. Some trends involving the plight of homeless people have provoked some thought, reflection, and debate. One such phenomenon is paid physical advertising, colloquially known as sandwich board men. Another trend is the side effect of unpaid free advertising of companies and organizations on shirts, clothing, and bags, to be worn by homeless and poor people, given out and donated by companies to homeless shelters and charitable organizations for otherwise altruistic purposes. These trends are reminiscent of the sandwich board signs carried by poor people in the time of Charles Dickens in the Victorian 19th century in England, and later during the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s. In the USA, the government asked many major cities to come up with a 10-year plan to end homelessness. One of the results of this was a housing first solution. Rather than to have a homeless person remain in an emergency homeless shelter, it was thought to be better to quickly get the person permanent housing of some sort and the necessary support services to sustain a new home. But there are many complications of this kind of program, and these must be dealt with to make such an initiative work successfully in the middle to long term. Some formerly homeless people, who were finally able to obtain housing and other assets which helped to return to a normal lifestyle, have donated money and volunteer services to the organizations that provided aid to them during the homelessness. Alternatively, some social service entities that help homeless people now employ formerly homeless individuals to assist in the care process. Homelessness has migrated toward rural and suburban areas. The number of homeless people has not changed dramatically, but the number of homeless families has increased according to a report of HUD. The United States Congress appropriated $25 million in the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Grants for 2008 to show the effectiveness of rapid rehousing programs in reducing family homelessness. In February 2009, President Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, part of which addressed homelessness prevention, allocating $1.5 billion for a homeless prevention fund. Emergency Shelter Grant Program's name was changed to Emergency Solution Grant Program, and funds were reallocated to assist with homeless prevention and rapid rehousing for families and individuals. On May 20, 2009, President Obama signed the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing Act into public law, reauthorizing HUD's homeless assistance programs. It was part of the Helping Families Save the Homes Act of 2009. The HEARTH Act allows for the prevention of homelessness, rapid rehousing, consolidation of housing programs, and new homeless categories. In the 18 months after the bill's signing, HUD must make regulations implementing this new McKinney program. The HEARTH Act also codifies in law the continuum of care planning process, long a part of HUD's application process to assist homeless persons by providing greater coordination in responding to the needs. This final rule integrates the regulation of the definition of homeless and the corresponding record-keeping requirements for the Shelter Plus Care program and the Supportive Housing program. This final rule Rule also establishes the regulation for the definition developmental disability and the definition and record-keeping requirements for homeless individual with a disability for the Shelter Plus Care program and the Supportive Housing program. In late 2009, some homeless advocacy organizations, such as the National Coalition for the Homeless, reported and published perceived problems with the Health Act of 2009 as an HUD-McKinney-Venter reauthorization bill, especially with regard to privacy, definitional ineligibility, community roles, and restrictions on eligible activities.